Sarah Martinez had always been different from other girls growing up in the small coastal town of Oceanside, California. While her classmates spent their afternoons at the mall or gossiping about boys, she could be found running along the beach at dawn, her feet pounding against the wet sand as the sun painted the horizon in brilliant oranges and pinks. Her father, a retired Marine, had instilled in her a discipline and determination that would later save her life in ways she never imagined. The decision to join the Navy came naturally to Sarah. She had grown up hearing stories of her grandfather's service in World War II, and her father's tales from Vietnam had painted pictures of honor, sacrifice, and brotherhood that stirred something deep within her soul. But when she announced her intention to pursue the most elite training the military had to offer, even her supportive family questioned whether she understood what she was getting into. The path to becoming a Navy SEAL was grueling beyond imagination. Sarah was among the first women to attempt the legendary Basic Underwater Demolition/SEAL training, known simply as BUD/S. The statistics were sobering. Less than 20% of candidates successfully completed the program, and the physical and mental demands had broken men who seemed invincible. For 6 months, Sarah endured hell on Earth. She carried telephone poles with her teammates, swam through freezing ocean waters in the dead of night, and pushed her body beyond every limit she thought possible. During Hell Week, the infamous 5-day period where candidates get only 4 hours of sleep total while enduring continuous physical training, Sarah found herself questioning everything. Her hands were raw and bleeding from rope climbs. Her legs felt like concrete pillars, and hallucinations danced at the edges of her vision from exhaustion. It was during this darkest moment that she discovered something profound about herself. Pain was temporary, but quitting was forever. She pressed on when others rang the bell and walked away, driven by a fire that burned deeper than physical discomfort. The underwater training nearly broke her. Strapped to the bottom of a swimming pool with full gear, she had to remain calm while instructors simulated equipment failures and emergency scenarios. Panic meant death, both in training and in real combat situations. Sarah learned to control her breathing, to find peace in chaos, and to trust in her training even when every instinct screamed danger. These lessons would prove invaluable years later when facing a very different kind of threat. Graduation day from BUD/S was bittersweet. Of the 180 candidates who had started the program alongside Sarah, only 23 remained. She stood among them, no longer the uncertain young woman who had arrived months earlier, but a warrior forged in the crucible of the world's most demanding military training. The Trident Pin ceremony was a moment of pure pride. She had earned her place among the most elite special operations forces in the world. Her first deployment took her to Afghanistan, where she served as part of a special reconnaissance unit. The mountains were unforgiving, the enemy was cunning, and every mission carried the weight of life and death. Sarah excelled in this environment, her small frame allowing her to move through tight spaces during building clearances, while her training enabled her to remain calm under fire. She saved 3 fellow SEALs during an ambush in Helmand Province, dragging wounded teammates to safety while enemy bullets whistled overhead. During her second tour, Sarah was part of a classified operation to rescue hostages being held by a terrorist cell in a remote compound. The mission required stealth, precision, and split-second decision-making. As the team moved through the darkened building, Sarah's training took over completely. She moved like a shadow, her weapon ready, every sense heightened to detect the slightest threat. When they found the hostages, 2 aid workers who had been captured weeks earlier, Sarah was the one who provided covering fire while her teammates extracted the civilians to safety. The psychological toll of combat was something no training could fully prepare someone for. Sarah witnessed things that would haunt her dreams for years to come. She saw the worst of humanity, but also discovered reservoirs of courage and compassion within herself and her teammates that she never knew existed. The bond formed between SEALs in combat was unlike anything else in the world. These men and women would literally die for each other, and Sarah proved herself worthy of that sacred trust time and again. After completing 3 successful deployments, Sarah made the difficult decision to transition back to civilian life. The military had given her purpose, structure, and an unshakable confidence in her abilities, but she felt called to use her skills in a different way. She earned a degree in social work and took a position helping veterans cope with post-traumatic stress, and reintegrate into civilian society. It was meaningful work that allowed her to serve her fellow warriors in a new capacity. The transition wasn't easy. Civilian life moved at a different pace, operated by different rules, and often felt shallow compared to the intensity of military service. Sarah struggled with feeling disconnected from people who had never experienced combat, who worried about trivial problems while she had memories of life and death situations burned into her mind. She found solace in physical training, maintaining the rigorous fitness standards that had become second nature during her military career. Sarah's work with veterans brought her into contact with some of the most damaged and heroic individuals she had ever met. Former soldiers who had lost limbs in explosions, Marines who couldn't sleep due to nightmares, sailors who had seen their ships attacked by enemy forces. Each carried invisible wounds that were just as real as any physical injury. Through counseling and support groups, Sarah helped these warriors find new purpose and meaning in civilian life. One particular case stayed with her. A former Army Ranger named Mike had been struggling with severe PTSD after losing his entire squad in an IED explosion in Iraq. He blamed himself for surviving when his brothers hadn't, and the guilt was eating him alive. Sarah worked with Mike for months, sharing some of her own experiences and helping him understand that survival wasn't something to feel guilty about, but rather an opportunity to honor his fallen comrades by living a meaningful life. The work was emotionally draining, but Sarah found it deeply fulfilling. She was making a real difference in people's lives, helping warriors who had sacrificed everything for their country find their way back to normalcy. Her colleagues admired her dedication and her unique ability to connect with clients who had previously been unreachable. Her military background gave her credibility that traditional therapists sometimes lacked when working with combat veterans. As months turned to years, Sarah began to feel more settled in her new life. She had found an apartment in a quiet neighborhood, started dating a teacher named David who respected her military service, and was building relationships with people who knew nothing about her past as a special operations warrior. It was a deliberate choice to keep that part of her life private. She wanted to be seen as Sarah the person, not Sarah the Navy SEAL. The decision to keep her military background quiet would later prove to be both a blessing and a curse. On one hand, it allowed her to build genuine relationships based on who she was as a civilian. On the other hand, it meant that when danger eventually found her, no one around her had any idea of the lethal skills that lay dormant beneath her unassuming exterior. Sarah's daily routine was simple and structured. She woke at 5 a.m. for a run along the beach, just as she had as a child. The rhythm of her feet on the sand and the sound of waves crashing nearby helped center her mind for the day ahead. After her workout, she would shower, dress in professional attire, and head to the Veterans Center where she worked. Her colleagues saw a dedicated social worker, who was perhaps more physically fit than most, but had no idea they were working alongside someone who had once been considered among the deadliest warriors in the world. The veterans she worked with occasionally sensed something different about her. There was a way she carried herself, a confidence in her movements, and an ability to remain calm in stressful situations that spoke to a deeper experience. Some of the older veterans, particularly those who had served in special operations themselves, occasionally asked probing questions about her background. Sarah would deflect these inquiries with practiced ease, redirecting conversations back to their treatment and recovery. Evening hours were spent in quiet activities, reading, cooking simple meals, or video calling her family back in California. Sarah had learned to appreciate the peaceful moments that civilian life offered, luxuries that were impossible during her military career. She treasured the ability to sleep through the night without wondering if mortars would start falling, to walk down streets without scanning for potential ambush sites, and to build relationships that weren't formed in the crucible of combat. Her relationship with David was growing stronger. He was a kind, gentle man who taught high school English and had a passion for literature that Sarah found refreshing. He knew she was a veteran but didn't pry into the specifics of her service. Their conversations ranged from books and movies to plans for weekend hiking trips in the nearby mountains. David brought lightness to Sarah's life, a counterbalance to the heavy emotional work she did with traumatized veterans. One evening, as they walked through downtown after dinner at their favorite restaurant, David commented on how safe he felt with Sarah. It was an innocent observation. He had noticed her awareness of their surroundings, the way she always positioned herself between him and potential threats, and her uncanny ability to spot trouble before it developed. Sarah smiled and squeezed his hand, thinking that if only he knew the true extent of her capabilities, he might feel differently about their evening strolls. The neighborhood where Sarah lived was generally considered safe, but like any urban area, it had its share of problems. She had noticed an increase in petty crime over recent months: car break-ins, purse snatchings, and occasional reports of assault. Her trained eye also picked up on subtle signs that others missed. The group of young men who seemed to hang around certain street corners without apparent purpose. The way some people crossed the street when they saw them approaching, and the nervous energy that had begun to permeate certain areas after dark. Sarah's military training had taught her to trust her instincts, and those instincts were telling her that something was building in her quiet neighborhood. She began varying her running routes and paying closer attention to the people around her during daily activities. Old habits die hard, and the situational awareness that had kept her alive in combat zones wasn't something that could simply be turned off in civilian life. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had survived multiple deployments to one of the world's most dangerous regions, only to sense potential danger in her own backyard. But Sarah had learned long ago that threats could come from anywhere, and that the same skills that made her an effective warrior overseas might someday be needed much closer to home. She just had no idea how soon that day would come, or how dramatically it would change everything. The first sign of trouble came on a Tuesday evening in late October. Sarah was walking home from the grocery store carrying 2 bags of supplies for the dinner she planned to cook for David that weekend. The autumn air was crisp, and the early sunset painted the sky in deep purples and oranges. She had chosen a route through the quiet residential streets rather than the busier main roads, preferring the peaceful atmosphere and the chance to decompress from a particularly challenging day at work. As she turned onto Maple Street, just 3 blocks from her apartment building, Sarah noticed them. 3 young men in their early 20s were walking about 50 yards behind her, matching her pace but not making any attempt to pass or take an alternative route. Her military training kicked in automatically, heightening her awareness without creating any outward sign of alarm. She continued walking normally while cataloging every detail about the individuals following her. The leader appeared to be the oldest, probably 24 or 25, with a lean but muscular build and tattoos covering his arms. His 2 companions were younger, maybe 19 or 20, and had the nervous energy of people trying to prove themselves. All 3 wore dark clothing and baseball caps pulled low over their faces. Sarah noted their positioning, spread out enough to prevent anyone from easily escaping if confronted, but close enough to communicate through gestures and eye contact. Rather than heading directly to her building, Sarah took a detour through a small park that would allow her to better assess the situation. If these men were simply walking in the same direction by coincidence, they would likely continue on the main street. If they followed her into the park, their intentions were probably not innocent. As she entered the tree-lined pathway, Sarah caught a reflection in a store window that confirmed her suspicions. All 3 men had followed her off the main road. The park was poorly lit and relatively secluded, exactly the kind of location predators would choose for an attack. Sarah's mind immediately began calculating options and escape routes while maintaining her casual pace. She could easily outrun them if necessary. Years of SEAL training had given her both speed and endurance that few people could match, but running would mean leaving them free to target someone else, possibly someone without the skills to defend themselves. As the men closed the distance behind her, Sarah made a decision that would have surprised anyone who knew her only as a social worker. Instead of speeding up or calling for help, she deliberately slowed her pace, allowing them to get closer. If these men intended to rob or assault someone tonight, it would be better for that someone to be her, rather than an innocent civilian who might be seriously injured or killed. Sarah had sworn an oath to protect others, and that commitment didn't end when she left the military. The attack came just as Sarah had anticipated, at the darkest section of the park where thick trees blocked most of the streetlight. The youngest of the 3 men rushed forward first, probably hoping to grab her purse and knock her down before she could react. What he encountered instead was someone whose reflexes had been honed by years of combat training and life-or-death situations. Sarah's response was instantaneous and devastating. As the first attacker reached for her, she dropped the grocery bags and pivoted smoothly to the side, using his own momentum against him. Her elbow connected with his solar plexus with surgical precision, driving all the air from his lungs and dropping him to his knees, gasping for breath. The entire movement took less than 2 seconds and was executed with the kind of fluid grace that only comes from thousands of hours of practice. The second attacker hesitated for a moment, clearly not expecting this level of resistance from what they had assumed would be an easy target. That moment of hesitation was all Sarah needed. She stepped forward and delivered a precise strike to his throat. Not hard enough to cause permanent damage, but sufficient to temporarily disable his ability to breathe normally. He stumbled backward, clutching his neck and making choking sounds. The leader of the group was smarter than his companions. Instead of rushing forward like the others, he pulled out a knife and began circling Sarah like a predator sizing up dangerous prey. This was the moment when the situation became truly serious. A weapon changed everything and required a much more careful response. Sarah's training had covered knife defense extensively, but she also knew that even the most skilled fighter could be seriously injured when facing a blade-wielding opponent. "Just give us your money and nobody gets hurt," the man said, his voice trying to project confidence but betraying an underlying uncertainty. He had clearly expected this encounter to be over by now, with his victim either running away in fear or lying unconscious on the ground. Instead, 2 of his friends were disabled, and he was facing someone who moved with the controlled precision of a trained fighter. Sarah didn't respond verbally. Instead, she shifted into a combat stance that would have been immediately recognizable to anyone with military training. Her weight was evenly distributed, her hands were up but not in a threatening position, and every muscle in her body was coiled and ready for explosive action. Her eyes never left the knife, tracking its movement while simultaneously monitoring her opponent's feet and body position for clues about his next attack. The man with the knife made his move with surprising speed, lunging forward in a slashing motion designed to catch Sarah across the chest or throat. But speed alone isn't enough when facing someone with Sarah's level of training. She had practiced knife defense scenarios hundreds of times, often against multiple opponents and in conditions far more challenging than a dimly lit park. Sarah's response was a masterclass in combat efficiency. She stepped inside the arc of the knife, getting closer to her attacker rather than backing away, which is what most people's instincts would tell them to do. This move put her inside his reach where the blade was less effective, while positioning her to control the weapon arm. Her left hand grabbed his wrist, while her right drove upward into his elbow joint with devastating force. The sound of bone breaking was audible even over the man's scream of pain. The knife clattered to the ground as his arm bent at an unnatural angle, and he collapsed beside it, cradling the injury and whimpering. The entire confrontation had lasted less than 30 seconds, and all 3 attackers were now neutralized. One struggling to breathe, one gasping with a damaged throat, and one with a severely broken arm. Sarah stood over them, her breathing barely elevated despite the physical exertion. This was the moment when her military background became impossible to hide. The way she had moved, the precision of her strikes, and the calm efficiency with which she had handled multiple armed attackers could only come from extensive special operations training. These men had made the mistake of targeting someone who was exponentially more dangerous than they were. As the immediate threat passed, Sarah's training kicked into the next phase, securing the situation and preventing escalation. She quickly retrieved the knife and any other weapons, then used zip ties from her keychain, a habit from her military days, to secure the most seriously injured attacker. The other 2 were in no condition to pose a continuing threat, but she kept them under close observation while calling for emergency services. When the police arrived, they found a scene that initially confused them. 3 young men were clearly injured and distressed, while a petite woman in professional clothes stood calmly nearby, completely unharmed. The lead officer's first assumption was that Sarah had been the victim of an attack and that someone else had intervened to help her. It took several minutes of explanation before they understood that she had single-handedly defeated all 3 assailants. The paramedics were particularly puzzled by the nature of the injuries. Each attacker had been disabled with surgical precision, incapacitated but not seriously injured beyond what was necessary to stop the threat. This wasn't the random violence typical of street fights, but rather the controlled application of force by someone with extensive training in hand-to-hand combat. One of the EMTs, a former Marine, quietly asked Sarah about her background. Sarah's response was measured and careful. She confirmed that she was a military veteran but didn't elaborate on the specifics of her training or service record. The police accepted her statement that she had acted in self-defense, especially since witness accounts and physical evidence clearly supported her version of events. However, she could see questions in their eyes, questions about how a social worker had been able to defeat 3 attackers so decisively. The incident report would eventually make its way through various bureaucratic channels, flagging attention from people who understood the implications of the fighting techniques that had been used. Sarah's name would be cross-referenced against military databases, and her service record, heavily classified though it was, would be noted by individuals who specialized in tracking former special operations personnel. For now, though, Sarah was more concerned with the immediate aftermath. The 3 men were taken into custody and charged with attempted robbery and assault. Medical reports indicated that their injuries were consistent with defensive actions rather than excessive force, which supported Sarah's claim of self-defense. The broken arm would require surgery, but all 3 attackers would recover fully from their encounter with someone far more dangerous than they had anticipated. The local news picked up the story within days, though initial reports focused on the attempted robbery rather than the victim's response. Headlines read, "Woman fights off 3 attackers," and "Local resident defends herself against armed robbers." The articles described Sarah as a military veteran with self-defense training, but didn't delve into the specifics of her background or the true extent of her capabilities. Sarah's colleagues at the Veterans Center were amazed by the news. They had worked alongside her for years without suspecting that she possessed such formidable combat skills. Some of the veterans she counseled began to look at her with new respect and understanding. They recognized the signs of elite training that they had missed before. Her calm demeanor under pressure and her instinctive situational awareness suddenly made perfect sense. David's reaction was more complicated. He was relieved that Sarah hadn't been injured, but also somewhat shaken by the revelation of her capabilities. The woman he had been dating for almost a year had just demonstrated that she could disable multiple armed attackers with her bare hands. It forced him to reconsider everything he thought he knew about her, and to wonder what other aspects of her past she hadn't shared with him. The conversation they had that evening was honest but difficult. Sarah explained more about her military service than she had ever shared before, though she still couldn't discuss the classified details of her missions or training. David struggled to reconcile the gentle, caring woman he loved with the warrior who had emerged during the attack. It would take time for him to process this new understanding of who Sarah really was. For Sarah, the incident was both a reminder and a warning. It reminded her that the skills she had learned in the military were still sharp and could be called upon when necessary. But it also warned her that her attempt to live quietly as a civilian might not be sustainable. The news coverage, the police report, and the attention from various agencies meant that her cover was beginning to slip. Word of the incident spread through underground networks that track individuals with special operations backgrounds. Sarah's name began appearing on lists maintained by private military contractors, mercenary organizations, and criminal enterprises that specialized in recruiting former elite soldiers. Her demonstration of skill in a real-world situation had inadvertently advertised her capabilities to people who might want to exploit them. Within 2 weeks, Sarah began noticing signs that she was being watched. Cars that appeared in her neighborhood too frequently, people who seemed to be conducting surveillance, and phone calls that disconnected when she answered. Her instincts told her that the park incident had attracted unwanted attention from individuals or organizations with their own agendas. The irony was bitter. Sarah had survived multiple combat deployments without her enemies ever learning her true identity. Now, defending herself against common street criminals had potentially exposed her to threats that were far more sophisticated and dangerous. She realized that her quiet civilian life might be coming to an end, and that she would need to make some difficult decisions about her future. As Halloween approached, Sarah found herself making mental preparations for possibilities she had hoped never to face again. She began varying her routines more extensively, checked her apartment for surveillance devices, and started carrying items that could serve as weapons if necessary. The warrior that she had tried to put to rest was awakening, and Sarah wasn't sure if that was a blessing or a curse. The surveillance began subtly, as it always does when conducted by professionals. Sarah first noticed it 3 days after Halloween, when a dark sedan appeared on her street for the 3rd time in a week. The vehicle would park in different locations each time, but always with a clear view of her apartment building's entrance. Through her bedroom window, she could occasionally make out the silhouette of someone sitting in the driver's seat, though they were careful never to be visible for long periods. Sarah's training had taught her to distinguish between paranoia and legitimate threat assessment. This wasn't paranoia, Someone was definitely conducting reconnaissance on her daily routines. The question was who and why. The possibilities ranged from law enforcement agencies checking up on her after the park incident to criminal organizations seeking revenge for the 3 men she had hospitalized. Neither option was particularly comforting. Her work at the Veterans Center continued normally, but Sarah found herself constantly aware of her surroundings in ways she hadn't been since returning from deployment. She varied her route to work each day, never taking the same path twice in a row. When meeting with clients, she positioned herself near exits and kept track of everyone who entered or left the building. Her colleagues began to notice her increased vigilance, but attributed it to lingering effects from the recent attack. The veterans Sarah counseled picked up on the change more quickly. Men and women who had served in combat zones recognized the hyper-vigilant behavior of someone who sensed danger. Marcus, a former Army Ranger who had been making excellent progress in his therapy sessions, pulled Sarah aside after one group meeting. "Ma'am, I don't know what's going on, but you're acting like someone who's expecting contact," he said quietly, using the military term for enemy engagement. "Is there something we should know about?" Sarah appreciated Marcus's concern, but couldn't involve him or any of her clients in whatever was developing around her. These were people who had already sacrificed enough for their country and were working hard to build new lives in civilian society. The last thing they needed was to be drawn into her problems. "I'm just being cautious after what happened in the park," she told Marcus, which was technically true even if it wasn't the complete truth. "Thank you for looking out for me, but I'm handling things." Marcus nodded but didn't look entirely convinced. "You know where to find us if you need backup," he said. It was a generous offer from someone who was still struggling with his own demons, and Sarah was touched by his willingness to help despite his ongoing challenges. The surveillance became more sophisticated over the following week. Sarah identified at least 3 different vehicles that were being rotated through the observation schedule, and she caught glimpses of individuals on foot who seemed to be conducting counter-surveillance to determine if she had noticed their presence. This level of coordination suggested resources beyond what street criminals could typically muster. David noticed the change in Sarah's behavior during their dinner date on Thursday evening. She had chosen a restaurant with multiple exits and requested a table that allowed her to observe the entire dining room. Throughout the meal, her attention kept drifting to the entrance and the other patrons, and she seemed to be mentally cataloging every person who entered or left. "Sarah, you're scaring me," David said finally, reaching across the table to take her hand. "Ever since that thing in the park, you've been different. More intense. Like you're expecting something bad to happen." Sarah squeezed his hand and tried to focus on his face instead of the potential threats she was unconsciously monitoring. "I'm sorry. I don't mean to worry you. It's just taking me longer to feel safe again than I expected." It was a reasonable explanation that David could understand and accept, but Sarah knew it wasn't fair to him. Their relationship was built on trust and openness, yet she was keeping him in the dark about dangers that might eventually affect him as well. The thought of involving an innocent civilian in her problems was unbearable, but the alternative might be pushing away someone she genuinely cared about. The decision was made for her the following Monday morning. Sarah arrived at work to find 2 men in expensive suits waiting in the lobby of the Veterans Center. They introduced themselves as Agents Morrison and Chen from the Department of Homeland Security and requested a private meeting to discuss matters related to national security. Sarah's supervisor was flustered by the sudden appearance of federal agents, but Sarah remained calm as she led them to a conference room. She had been expecting this conversation ever since the park incident, though she had hoped it might not come. Her military service record contained information that various government agencies would find interesting, especially if they were concerned about former special operations personnel living in civilian communities. "Ms. Martinez," Agent Morrison began, "we understand you served with distinction in Navy Special Operations. Your record indicates extensive training in combat techniques, weapons handling, and classified mission protocols." "That's correct," Sarah replied evenly. "But I've been honorably discharged for over 2 years now, and I'm working as a licensed social worker. My military service is in the past." Agent Chen leaned forward slightly. "Unfortunately, the past has a way of catching up with people in your former line of work. We've received intelligence suggesting that certain organizations may be taking an interest in recruiting former SEALs for private military operations. Some of these organizations don't take no for an answer." The implications of his statement hit Sarah immediately. The surveillance she had noticed wasn't necessarily from government agencies or revenge-seeking criminals. It might be from private military contractors or mercenary organizations that specialized in recruiting former special operations personnel for jobs that existing militaries couldn't or wouldn't handle. "What kind of organizations are we talking about?" Sarah asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "The kind that operate in gray areas between legal and illegal, between government-sanctioned and completely rogue," Morrison replied. "They offer enormous sums of money to former elite soldiers for missions that range from corporate security to assassination. Most veterans are smart enough to walk away, but these groups can be very persuasive." Sarah understood the subtext. Some former special operations personnel had been recruited voluntarily, while others had been coerced through threats against themselves or their families. The skills that made SEALs so effective in legitimate military operations also made them valuable to criminal organizations with the resources to hire them. "Why are you telling me this?" Sarah asked, though she was beginning to suspect the answer to that question as well. Agent Chen produced a tablet computer and showed her a series of surveillance photographs. The images showed her apartment building, her workplace, and several locations where she regularly spent time. The photos had been taken with professional equipment and demonstrated a level of sophistication that confirmed her worst suspicions. "Someone has been watching you for the past 2 weeks," Chen explained. "We've been watching them watch you, trying to determine their intentions and capabilities. Based on the resources they're deploying and the patience they're showing, we believe they're planning to make contact soon." Morrison picked up the explanation. "These groups usually start with an offer that seems too good to refuse. Enormous payment for a single mission, guarantees of safety and anonymity, promises that the work is completely legal and sanctioned by legitimate governments. When that doesn't work, they sometimes resort to pressure tactics." Sarah felt a cold knot forming in her stomach. What kind of pressure tactics? Threats against family members, manufactured legal problems, economic pressure through loss of employment, Chen listed grimly. In extreme cases, staged accidents or attacks designed to demonstrate their capabilities and convince the target that cooperation is the safer option. The room fell silent as Sarah processed this information. She had hoped that leaving the military would mean leaving behind the dangers and moral complexities of special operations work. Instead, it seemed that her skills had made her a target for people who wanted to exploit those very capabilities for their own purposes. "What do you want from me?" Sarah asked finally. Morrison and Chen exchanged a look before Morrison responded. "We want you to be aware of the situation and prepared for what might be coming. If these people approach you, we need to know about it immediately. If they make threats, we need to know. If they try to pressure you in any way, we need to know. Are you asking me to be an informant?" Sarah's voice was carefully neutral, but there was steel underneath the calm tone. "We're asking you to help us protect other veterans from being exploited by criminal organizations," Chen replied. "You're not the only former SEAL they're targeting, and the missions they're recruiting for are not the kind that serve legitimate national interests." Sarah asked for time to consider their request, and the agents agreed to give her 24 hours to make a decision. They left their contact information and reminded her to be extremely careful about her personal security until the situation was resolved. As they walked away, Sarah realized that her carefully constructed civilian life was beginning to unravel completely. That evening, Sarah called her father for the first time in weeks. Without revealing the specific details of what was happening, she asked him about his experiences with transition back to civilian life after Vietnam. Had he ever felt like his military past was following him? Had anyone ever tried to recruit him for questionable activities after his discharge? Her father was quiet for a long moment before answering. "The skills you learn in special operations don't just disappear when you take off the uniform," he said finally. "There are always people who want to use those skills for their own purposes. The key is remembering who you really are and what you really stand for." It was good advice, but Sarah wasn't sure it would be enough to navigate the complex situation she was facing. Someone wanted to hire her for work that was probably illegal and definitely dangerous. Federal agents wanted her to spy on those same people. Meanwhile, she was trying to maintain relationships with David, her colleagues, and the veterans she counseled, all while keeping them safe from dangers they didn't even know existed. Sarah spent most of that night thinking about her options. She could cooperate with the federal agents and potentially help protect other veterans from exploitation. She could refuse to get involved and hope that the mysterious organization would simply move on to easier targets. Or she could take more proactive steps to protect herself and the people she cared about. By morning, she had made her decision. Sarah called Agent Morrison and agreed to cooperate with their investigation, but on her own terms. She would provide information about any contact from criminal organizations, but she wouldn't actively seek out such contact or put herself in unnecessary danger. She also insisted on protection for David and her family if the situation escalated beyond simple surveillance. Morrison agreed to her conditions, though he warned her that the people they were dealing with were extremely sophisticated and potentially very dangerous. "These aren't street criminals like the ones you handled in the park," he cautioned. "They're professionals with extensive resources and no moral constraints." Sarah understood the warning, but she also understood something that the federal agents might not have fully grasped. She wasn't the same person she had been 2 weeks ago. The attack in the park had awakened skills and instincts that she had tried to leave behind, and the surveillance had sharpened her edge even further. If criminal organizations wanted to target former SEALs, they might discover that they had chosen the wrong profession to exploit. The waiting game began in earnest. Sarah continued her normal routines while remaining hyper-aware of everything happening around her. She noticed when the surveillance patterns changed, when new faces appeared in her neighborhood, and when old ones disappeared. The people watching her were good, but they weren't quite good enough to remain completely invisible to someone with her training. 3 days after her meeting with the federal agents, Sarah noticed something different. The surveillance had become more active, as if the people watching her were preparing to make some kind of move. Vehicles followed her more closely. Individuals made less effort to remain hidden, and she began receiving hang-up phone calls at unusual hours. The endgame was approaching, and Sarah had no idea what form it would take. All she knew was that very soon she would need to decide who she really was, the quiet social worker trying to build a peaceful life, or the warrior who had sworn to protect others regardless of personal cost. The contact came on a rainy Thursday evening in the form of a well-dressed woman who approached Sarah outside the Veterans Center. Elena Vasquez looked like a successful businesswoman, complete with an expensive suit, designer briefcase, and the kind of confident bearing that suggested she was accustomed to being taken seriously. She waited until Sarah's colleagues had left before making her approach, demonstrating knowledge of Sarah's schedule and work environment. Miss Peel was incarcerated. "Martinez, I represent a private security consulting firm that specializes in high-end protection services," Elena said, extending a business card that identified her as a senior partner with Blackstone International Solutions. "We've become aware of your exceptional background and would like to discuss a business opportunity that I think you'll find very attractive." Sarah accepted the business card and examined it carefully. The company name wasn't familiar, but that didn't mean much in the shadowy world of private military contracting. She noticed that Elena's accent carried traces of Eastern European origin, though her English was flawless and her mannerisms suggested extensive education and experience dealing with Western business customs. "I'm not interested in private security work," Sarah replied politely. "I'm very happy with my current position helping veterans transition to civilian life," Elena smiled, but the expression didn't reach her eyes. "I understand your commitment to helping fellow veterans, and I admire that dedication. However, the opportunity I'm offering would allow you to help veterans on a much larger scale while earning compensation that would enable you to fund far more extensive programs than your current budget allows." The pitch was skillfully crafted, appealing to Sarah's genuine desire to help other veterans while dangling the carrot of significantly increased resources. It was exactly the kind of approach that the federal agents had warned her about, offers that seemed too good to refuse while carefully avoiding any mention of the specific duties that would be required. "What kind of work are we talking about?" Sarah asked, playing along while mentally noting every detail of the encounter for her eventual report to Agents Morrison and Chen. "Executive protection for high-profile clients in challenging environments," Elena responded smoothly. "Your military background and specialized training make you ideal for assignments that require discretion, professionalism, and the ability to handle unexpected threats. The compensation starts at $50,000 per month, with bonuses for successful mission completion." $50,000 per month was indeed an enormous sum, far more than Sarah could earn in an entire year at her current job. For a moment, She allowed herself to consider what she could accomplish with that kind of money. Expanded programs for veterans, better facilities, more staff to help traumatized soldiers rebuild their lives. But her training had taught her to be suspicious of offers that seemed too good to be true. "That's a very generous offer," Sarah acknowledged. "But I'd need to know much more about the specific duties and the nature of your clients before I could consider making such a significant career change."
Elena reached into her briefcase and produced a thick folder.
"This contains detailed information about our company, our mission statement, and examples of the type of work you'd be performing. I'd encourage you to review it carefully and call me when you're ready to discuss the opportunity further." Sarah accepted the folder but didn't commit to reading it or calling for further discussions. Elena seemed to expect this response and didn't pressure her for an immediate answer. Instead, she mentioned that she would be in town for several more days and hoped to hear from Sarah soon. The entire interaction had lasted less than 10 minutes, but Sarah understood that it represented the opening move in what could become a very dangerous game. As Elena walked away, Sarah noticed a black SUV waiting at the curb. The vehicle had tinted windows and government license plates, suggesting that Blackstone International Solutions had resources and connections that went beyond typical private security companies. Sarah memorized the plate number and made mental notes about Elena's appearance, mannerisms, and speech patterns. Back in her apartment, Sarah examined the folder Elena had given her. The materials were professionally produced and contained impressive testimonials from supposed clients, detailed descriptions of training facilities and equipment, and photographs of personnel who looked like former military special operations soldiers. However, her trained eye noticed several red flags that suggested the company wasn't entirely what it claimed to be. The testimonials were generic and could have been written by anyone. The photographs of personnel and facilities appeared to be stock images rather than actual documentation. Most tellingly, the specific examples of successful missions were vague and unverifiable, lacking the kind of concrete details that legitimate security companies would typically provide to demonstrate their capabilities. Sarah called Agent Morrison and arranged an emergency meeting for the following morning. When she handed over the business card and folder, both agents immediately recognized the materials as sophisticated recruitment tools used by criminal organizations to entice former special operations personnel into illegal activities. "Blackstone International Solutions doesn't exist," Agent Chen informed her. "The business registration is fake, the address is a mail drop, and the phone number routes through several layers of forwarding services to mask its true destination. Elena Vasquez is probably an alias as well." Morrison examined the folder more carefully. "This is high-quality propaganda designed to make illegal mercenary work sound like legitimate private security consulting. The real question is what they want you to do and who they're working for. The $50,000 per month suggests they have serious funding behind them," Sarah observed. "That's not the kind of money that gets thrown around casually, even in the private military industry." The agents agreed and explained that they had been tracking this particular recruitment operation for several months. The organization behind it appeared to be connected to various criminal enterprises around the world, including drug cartels, human trafficking networks, and rogue governments seeking to hire foreign fighters for conflicts they couldn't officially participate in. "Every person they've successfully recruited has either disappeared completely or turned up dead within 6 months, Chen said grimly. "These aren't people who honor contracts or respect the welfare of their employees. They use former special operations personnel for extremely dangerous missions, then eliminate them to prevent testimony or demands for additional compensation." Sarah felt a chill as she realized the true scope of what she was dealing with. This wasn't just about recruitment for questionable private security work, it was about exploitation and ultimately murder of former military personnel who had already sacrificed so much for their country. "What do they want me to do?" she asked. Morrison and Chen explained that her role would be to string Elena along while gathering intelligence about the organization's structure, funding sources, and current operations. They would monitor all communications and provide backup if the situation became dangerous, but Sarah would need to maintain the pretense of being interested in their offer while avoiding any actual commitment. "It's going to be extremely dangerous," Morrison warned. "These people are sophisticated enough to detect deception if you're not very careful. And if they realize you're working with us, they won't hesitate to eliminate you as a security risk." Sarah understood the risks but agreed to proceed with the operation. Too many veterans had already been victimized by this organization, and she couldn't stand by while others were lured into what amounted to death traps disguised as lucrative job opportunities. The follow-up call from Elena came 3 days later. His elated assessment that the person who had used these experiences was eventually done with a time decision because this person was becoming in particular, but a person that rose into the pile of rows of means, was a person which become rapidly suspicious person. We handle all legal and liability issues for our personnel, Elena assured her. Our clients prefer absolute discretion, which means that certain aspects of the work must remain confidential, even from immediate family members. But I can guarantee that you'll be working for legitimate governments and corporations that require protection services in sensitive situations. The meeting was scheduled for the following Monday at an upscale hotel downtown. Elena suggested that Sarah bring any questions she might have about the company or the specific assignment they had in mind for her. She also mentioned that other former military personnel would be present to share their experiences and help Sarah understand what a rewarding career opportunity this represented. Sarah agreed to the meeting while privately noting that Elena's mention of other former military personnel suggested this was either a group recruitment session or a way to use peer pressure to convince reluctant candidates. Either way, it indicated that the organization was confident enough to expose multiple operatives at once. The weekend before the scheduled meeting was tense. Sarah maintained her normal routines while conducting counter-surveillance to determine if she was being watched more closely in preparation for Monday's encounter. She also worked with agents Morrison and Chen to develop communication protocols and emergency procedures in case the meeting went wrong. Remember, your primary objective is intelligence gathering, Morrison reminded her during their final briefing. We need names, locations, organizational structure, and information about their current operations. But if you feel threatened at any point, abort immediately and get to the extraction point we've established. Sarah reviewed the evacuation routes and emergency signals they had developed, then spent Sunday evening making preparations that her federal handlers didn't know about. She concealed emergency supplies in strategic locations around the city, and made sure that David had detailed instructions about what to do if she failed to contact him by a specific deadline. Monday morning arrived, gray and cold, matching Sarah's mood as she prepared for what could be the most dangerous mission of her life. Unlike her military deployments, this operation would take place on familiar ground, but without the support of a trained team. She would be walking into hostile territory alone, relying entirely on her training and instincts to survive. As she dressed for the meeting, Sarah caught her reflection in the bathroom mirror. The woman looking back at her was no longer the peaceful social worker who had been building a quiet civilian life. The warrior had returned, and Sarah wasn't sure if that transformation was temporary or permanent. The taxi ride to the hotel gave her time for final mental preparations. She reviewed her cover story, checked her emergency communication devices, and mentally rehearsed the various scenarios that Morrison and Chen had prepared her for. By the time the cab pulled up to the hotel entrance, Sarah had transformed completely into the role she would need to play. Elena was waiting in the lobby, accompanied by 2 men who immediately triggered Sarah's threat assessment training. Both were obviously former military, probably special operations based on their bearing and the way they continuously scanned their surroundings. They were polite and professional, but Sarah could sense the lethal capabilities that lay beneath their civilized exteriors. "Sarah, I'm so glad you decided to join us," Elena said warmly. "Let me introduce you to Marcus and Victor, 2 of our senior consultants who can tell you about their experiences working with Blackstone." As they walked toward the elevators, Sarah realized that she was now completely committed to a course of action that could end with her death or disappearance. But she also knew that backing down would mean allowing this organization to continue exploiting and murdering other veterans. The mission had begun, and there was no turning back. The hotel suite on the 15th floor was luxuriously appointed, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the city below. Elena had chosen the location carefully, high enough to prevent easy surveillance from neighboring buildings, with multiple exit routes through the hotel's complex layout. It was the kind of setting that projected success and legitimacy while providing tactical advantages for people who had reason to be paranoid about observation. Marcus and Victor positioned themselves strategically around the room as Elena began her presentation. Both men appeared relaxed, but Sarah's trained eye noticed that they maintained clear lines of sight to all entrances and kept their hands free for rapid access to concealed weapons. These weren't just former military personnel, they were professionals who remained operational despite their civilian appearance. Sarah, we're very excited about the possibility of adding someone with your background to our team, Elena began, activating a tablet computer that projected images onto a wall-mounted screen. The assignment we have in mind would utilize your specialized training while providing an opportunity to serve your country's interests in ways that conventional military operations cannot. The presentation that followed was masterfully crafted to appeal to Sarah's sense of duty and patriotism. Elena described a scenario involving American civilians being held hostage by a terrorist organization in a country where the U.S. military could not officially operate. The rescue mission would require a small team of highly trained operatives who could work without government oversight or acknowledgement. The hostages include 2 aid workers and a journalist who were captured while documenting human rights abuses. Elena explained, showing photographs of 3 young Americans who looked genuinely distressed and terrified. Their families have been told that official rescue attempts are impossible due to diplomatic constraints, but private organizations with the right capabilities might be able to help. Sarah studied the photographs carefully while maintaining an expression of concern and interest. The images looked authentic, but her training had taught her to be suspicious of emotional manipulation tactics used by hostile intelligence services. The entire scenario could be fabricated, designed to trigger her protective instincts and override her logical assessment of the situation. Marcus spoke up for the first time, his voice carrying the confident tone of someone who had participated in genuine rescue operations. "I was on the team that extracted those civilians from Syria last year," he said, referring to a mission that had been widely reported in international media. "It's incredibly satisfying work knowing that you're saving innocent lives when no one else can or will help them." The reference to a real rescue mission was clever, designed to establish Marcus's credibility while implying that Blackstone International Solutions had been responsible for legitimate humanitarian operations. However, Sarah remembered reading about the Syria rescue and recalled that it had been conducted by a legitimate private military company with proper government authorization. Victor added his own testimonial about the professional satisfaction and financial rewards of working with Elena's organization. He spoke eloquently about the high-quality equipment, extensive support resources, and generous compensation packages that made the risks worthwhile. His accent suggested Eastern European origins, possibly Russian or Ukrainian, which raised additional questions about the organization's true loyalties. The compensation for this particular mission would be $200,000 for successful completion, Elena announced, watching Sarah's reaction carefully, plus all expenses, full medical coverage, and life insurance benefits for your designated beneficiaries. "We take care of our people because we understand the sacrifices involved in this kind of work." $200,000 was an enormous sum that would completely change Sarah's financial situation and allow her to fund veteran assistance programs beyond anything she could currently imagine. For a moment, she allowed herself to consider what good could be accomplished with that kind of money, while remaining aware that the offer was almost certainly fraudulent. "What exactly would my role be in this mission?" Sarah asked, playing her part while gathering intelligence about the organization's operational methods. Elena activated another screen showing a detailed building layout and mission timeline. "You would be part of a 4-person extraction team responsible for infiltrating the compound where the hostages are being held, neutralizing any resistance, and evacuating the civilians to a secure location for transport back to the United States." The mission plan was surprisingly detailed and professionally developed, suggesting that someone with genuine military planning experience had been involved in its creation. However, several elements didn't make sense to someone with Sarah's background in special operations. The timeline was too aggressive, the extraction route was overly complicated, and the contingency plans seemed inadequate for the level of opposition they claimed to expect. Sarah asked a series of technical questions about communication protocols, medical support, and backup extraction options. Elena's responses were smooth and confident, but lacked the specific details that would indicate actual operational experience. It became increasingly clear that the entire presentation was an elaborate fiction designed to recruit her for something very different from a humanitarian rescue mission. "When would this mission take place?" Sarah inquired, noting that Marcus and Victor were watching her reactions very carefully. "We're hoping to launch within 2 weeks," Elena replied. The intelligence indicates that the hostages' situation is deteriorating rapidly, and we may not have much time before their captors decide they're too much trouble to keep alive. The urgency was another red flag. Legitimate rescue operations required extensive planning, intelligence gathering, and coordination that couldn't be accomplished in 2 weeks. The pressure to make a quick decision was a classic manipulation technique used to prevent targets from conducting thorough research or seeking outside advice. Sarah expressed enthusiasm about the mission while asking for time to consider the opportunity and arrange her personal affairs. Elena seemed pleased by her apparent interest, but mentioned that they would need a definitive answer within 48 hours due to the time-sensitive nature of the operation. "Of course, we completely understand that this is a major decision," Elena said. "Marcus and Victor will be available to answer any additional questions you might have, and we can arrange for you to speak with other team members who have participated in similar missions." As the meeting concluded, Elena handed Sarah a secure satellite phone and explained that it would allow them to communicate without risk of interception by hostile intelligence services. She emphasized the importance of operational security and reminded Sarah not to discuss the opportunity with anyone who wasn't directly involved in the mission. The ride down in the elevator was tense. Sarah maintained her cover while mentally cataloging everything she had observed during the meeting. Marcus and Victor flanked her, maintaining the pretense of casual conversation while clearly monitoring her behavior for signs of deception or reluctance. "You remind me of someone I served with in Afghanistan," Victor said as they walked through the hotel lobby. She had the same kind of focus and determination that made her incredibly effective in combat situations. "I think you're going to do very well with our organization." The comment was designed to build rapport while reinforcing the military connection, but it also contained a subtle threat. Victor was letting Sarah know that he was assessing her capabilities and that he had experience dealing with women who possessed similar training. Outside the hotel, Elena offered to have Marcus drive Sarah home, but she declined and called a taxi instead. As her cab pulled away from the curb, Sarah noticed the black SUV from their previous encounter following at a discreet distance. The surveillance was continuing, probably to monitor her behavior and determine whether she was likely to accept their offer or report their approach to law enforcement. Sarah had the taxi driver take several detours and make unexpected stops to test whether they were being followed. The SUV stayed with them through multiple turns and route changes, confirming that the organization was maintaining close observation of her movements. They were taking no chances with someone who possessed her level of training and security clearance. Back in her apartment, Sarah immediately activated the emergency communication protocol she had arranged with agents Morrison and Chen. The secure phone Elena had given her was almost certainly equipped with tracking and monitoring capabilities, so she hid it in a location where it would appear to be in use while actually being isolated from any sensitive conversations. The debriefing with the federal agents took place in a secure facility downtown. Morrison and Chen were particularly interested in the mission details Elena had presented, as well as the identities and backgrounds of Marcus and Victor. The information Sarah provided would be cross-referenced against databases of known mercenaries, war criminals, and international fugitives. "The hostage scenario is completely fabricated," Chen confirmed after checking the photographs against missing persons databases. "Those images were taken from a human trafficking awareness campaign 3 years ago. The people in the photos are actors, not actual hostages." Morrison added that the building layout Elena had shown appeared to be based on a real facility in Eastern Europe that was currently being used as a training camp for mercenaries working for various criminal organizations. "If you had agreed to participate in this mission, you would have been walking into a trap designed to eliminate you once you had served their purposes." The revelation was chilling but not entirely surprising. Sarah had suspected from the beginning that the offer was too good to be true, and the mission details had contained too many inconsistencies to be legitimate. The real question was how to proceed with the investigation while avoiding the trap that had been set for her. "We need you to maintain contact long enough for us to identify the leadership structure and funding sources," Morrison explained. "But we also need to be prepared for the possibility that they'll become suspicious and decide to eliminate you as a security risk." Sarah agreed to continue the operation while implementing additional security measures to protect herself and the people she cared about. David would be moved to a safe location under federal protection, and her family in California would be provided with discreet security details until the threat was neutralized. The next 24 hours were critical. Sarah used the secure phone to contact Elena and express continued interest in the mission, while raising additional questions about logistics and support systems. Elena's responses became increasingly evasive, suggesting that the organization was preparing to abandon the recruitment pretense and move to more direct methods of coercion. "I think they're planning to grab you tomorrow night," Morrison warned during their final planning session. "Intelligence indicates that a team has been assembled specifically for that purpose. If you're not completely convinced that you want to work for them, they'll try to force your cooperation through threats or actual violence." Sarah made her choice with the same clarity and decisiveness that had carried her through combat operations in Afghanistan. She wouldn't allow this organization to continue exploiting and murdering veterans, and she wouldn't run from a fight when innocent people needed protection. That evening, she prepared her apartment for what was likely to be the final confrontation. Hidden cameras would record everything that happened, emergency weapons were concealed in strategic locations, and escape routes were prepared in case the situation required tactical withdrawal. Sarah also left detailed instructions for David and her family about what to do if she didn't survive the operation. As darkness fell over the city, Sarah Martinez, veteran of 3 combat deployments, graduate of the world's most demanding military training, and protector of those who couldn't protect themselves, prepared for a battle that would determine whether she could finally find peace in civilian life or whether her warrior's path would never truly end. The secure phone rang at exactly midnight. Elena's voice was no longer friendly and professional, but cold and threatening. "Martinez, I think it's time we had a more honest conversation about your future. My associates will be visiting you shortly to discuss terms that are not negotiable." Sarah smiled grimly as she checked her weapons one final time. After months of hiding who she really was, it felt liberating to finally stop pretending. The 3 men who had attacked her in the park had learned too late that they had chosen the wrong victim. Elena's associates were about to learn the same lesson.